There are new fears this morning about the club's financial position. Fees worth tens of millions of pounds owed to former owners and 5 other smaller shareholders that were due to be paid last year have been deferred until April. Alarm bells. Why is that? Why is that? Do they need money? Why do they need money? Well, maybe this is why they sold Chris Wood to Newcastle for 25 million quid. It gives the owners a chance to find other income. But why are they in this position that they find themselves in? I mean, should there be alarm bells ringing about this? Why was a takeover allowed by the Premier League if the owners didn't actually have the financial clout to fund the club?
Well, look, in the absence of an alternate view, you have to draw conclusions, don't you? When I first saw this transaction, it's one thing buying Man United and loading it with debt and asking the club's cash flow to be able to fund that debt. It's another thing Burnley doing the similar thing. Of course, Burnley's cost of acquisition, i.e. the price you pay for it, is going to be less than Man United, but the revenue from Burnley is massively less.
Yeah.
So I always thought it was a slightly risky and flawed set of thinking. It's an American model, a leveraged purchase, which enables you to use your own money and other people's money to be able to find a football club. And it's not necessarily a bad way to do business, but it's a bad way if you leave your margins of error open, like getting relegated, which Burnley are always susceptible to because they aren't a club that spends enormous amounts of money. The Premier League is polarising with more and more clubs having more and more owners that are prepared to spend more and more money. And a purchase that involves people loading it with debt means they don't have the money in the first place. And then we saw some of the other nonsense like we're going to deal with artificial intelligence as our scouting network and so on and so forth. And it all brought me to a conclusion that there is a worry there. Look, in the absence of any observations from Alan Pask, we're going to operate in a space where it looks concerning. I maintain the view that they sold Chris Wood because they got a cash payment up front from Newcastle and not necessarily because they had to, because
they needed the money.
I believe that there was a release clause and a financial obligation. One was satisfied and that the release clause was for the summer. And despite Burnley putting out a press statement or a release saying they met the release clauses, that's a bit ambiguous because I think the release clauses were in the summer more than there were 2 of them, finance and timing. I worry for this because I do believe if they get relegated, they're in trouble and they might be okay for a season. But then when the parachute payments drop from 60 million quid to half of that, they're going to either have a fire sale of players if they don't get back out of the division, if they get relegated, of course.
Yeah.
Or they're going to have a real challenge. So I think it's a very, very iffy territory for Burnley, and I've said this from the outset. I hope that I'm wrong. I suspect that I may not be. I then look at the parameters of why the Premier League allowed this. Well, how can the Premier League stop it? Debt is a reasonable commodity. If you go and buy a Grade 2 listed house with a blue pack on it, it's protected by national heritage. It doesn't mean you can't buy it. It doesn't mean you can't get a mortgage on it. It means that ultimately it's protected by a greater institution and you can't do certain things with it. So the Premier League have looked at what these guys said, at what these guys would have produced as a business plan, at what this guy's model was, and they would have been susceptible to it in the same way that you can't argue for the fact of scrutiny in the way they scrutinised Newcastle. They probably scrutinised Burnley from a different perspective. So you can't lay the blame at the Premier League's door because debt financing is available in every other walk of life and it shouldn't be unavailable in sports.
Well, I mean, you get the deal done, but somewhat under the radar, don't you? I mean, if you finance it that well, look at what happened to Craig White with Rangers.
It's not under
he borrowed money against advanced season ticket sales, and all hell broke loose.
Yes, of course.
It went to a court of law at the end of it, and he walked.
But with respect,
there was havoc.
So did Sunderland do the same thing? Stuart Donald did the exact same thing at Sunderland. He used the parachute payments that were coming in from the Premier League, discounted them, borrowed against them and used that money to buy the football club in the first place.
So, Simon, basically, should Burnley fans really press the panic button if Burnley go down?
They should be uneasy. Yeah, I don't think this ownership model is the right one for Burnley Football Club. And I don't think, you've also got to look at with due respect to Mike Garlick and his guys, they sold it to them. They have every right to sell something to someone else.
They're still waiting for the money.
And they're still waiting for their money. And one of the casualties of their decision-making process, maybe they'll have to wait for their money for some time.
Yes.
Because if the choice is pay the exiting shareholders or support the football club, with the best will in the world, neither one of them is ideal, but I'm sure they'll make the decision to support the football club rather than pay the exiting shareholders.
And what was their ownership model, Simon? How can you define this? Well, for the Burnley fans who are listening this morning who are concerned, and other fans around the country who have owners of a similar type nature.
They borrow money to be able to complete the transaction, and they use the club's positive cash flow to service the debt repayments. So as long as the club has positive cash flow and is able to sustain itself, and that will only be by being in the Premier League, then they can keep meeting the debt payments. They can make the bullet payments that they'll have to make. Bullet payments means lump sums to the owners, because the owners took a set of payments, an upfront payment, which was borrowed and paid. Some of it was capital brought in by Alan Pask and his gang, and a lot of it was Alan Pace, and a lot of it was borrowed money. And then you've got the other part of it was secured against future revenue. So they're going to take the money that Burnley get from the Premier League, and they're going to take some of that against positive cash flow, and they're going to drop it to the outgoing owners.
I see.
So that's how they've done it. Now,
so if they go down, will this lot immediately try and offload the club?
Well, who to? And on what basis? And it won't obviate the obligations they have to the existing shareholders. What they'll have to do is either pony up some of their own money and more of it, which doesn't seem that they're particularly keen to do.
Which is what you did.
Because they didn't do it in the first place, right?
It's painful.
Or they're going to go back to the existing shareholders, which is more likely, i.e. Mike Garlick and his lot, and say, you're going to have to whistle for the time being, right? Because we can't afford to take the money out of the club to pay you what we agreed to pay you over a period of time, because we no longer have that cash. All of it is a bit of a Horlicks for Burnley, because Burnley was a decent... Mike Garlick had every right to leave. But don't forget, if Mike Garlick and the existing shareholders didn't want 170 million quid, then the Burnley Football Club wouldn't have been bought for 170 million quid and wouldn't have debts. But what really should have happened, was the incoming purchasers should have bought the club.
I see, yes.
But because they didn't buy it, they loaded it with debt, because that's a clever way to do business, only if you don't fall in between the cracks. And between the cracks is the worst case scenario of getting relegated, and you have to factor in the possibility of Burnley Football Club at some point in the immediate future, in the 3 or 4 years that it would have taken to service the debt to Mike Garlick and the exiting shareholders, might have got relegated. Yes. Sean Dyche, who was holding it together on the football side, might have left. So I have never been comfortable with those guys. All the smart Alec talk about how you leverage purchases and how the Americans coming in and this, that and the other, and artificial intelligence for the scouting network, it cut the ice with me. The bottom line was, you wanted to buy this football club with other people's money, and unless you're going to service the debt, or unless you're going to bridge the gap if it falls in between the cracks, you had no business being there in the first place.
If Pace was sitting in the studio with us right now,
exactly what I just said to you.
What would your big hit question be?
Why did you buy a football club loaded with debt, not understanding the fact there was a huge risk, and how are you going to bridge that gap? Are you going to sit here, if this club gets relegated, worst case scenario, with a gap in your cash flow? Are you going to meet the obligations personally and through your investment team to pay the existing shareholders? And are you going to bridge the gap if the football club doesn't have enough revenue to service the player contracts next year? Are you going to do that, or are you not? It's not a difficult question to answer.
Exactly.
They won't want to be asked that question or answer it.
Well, it's not beyond the wit of us. If we can't bring him to here, we can always fire off an email to him today.
I hope they do come.
Well, we'll fire off an email.
And I hope they put me in my place and tell me that
exactly
I'm wrong.
like that. Yeah, and we'll see what we get back. But we'll keep on asking the questions. It's 11:15.
Jim White and Simon Jordan, Monday to Thursday morning, 10 till 1. On AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app, and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.